Dr. Avital, who's going to give a presentation now on a mind that cannot hear, early Chinese perception of deafness. Please, Avital.
So thank you very, very much for moderating this session, Bouphe. Over the past few years, many studies have been published that focus on the senses in early China in general, with some dedicating some attention to hearing specifically. Deafness, however, has scarcely been discussed in existing works. And what I'm currently doing is I'm in the process of compiling what, to my knowledge, will be the first comprehensive study of deafness in early Chinese account. And if anyone knows any additional such studies, I would love to have references. In my talk today, I will give a very brief overview of the kinds of references to deafness that exist in Warring States and Han texts. While I will include a brief discussion on the early Chinese physiological and terminological understandings of deafness, my main focus will be on philosophical and political accounts in an attempt to understand early Chinese social perceptions or approaches towards deafness. But let me begin with a somewhat more recent reference to deafness and a somewhat unusual one to its times. In 1845, Victor Hugo wrote a letter to Ferdinand Berthier, a leading deaf intellectual and one of the pioneering advocates for deaf culture and identity. He is cited as writing, "What matters deafness of the ear when the mind hears? The one true deafness, the incurable deafness, is that of the mind," end quote. Thousands of miles away and about 2 millennia earlier, the following passage depicting an entirely different picture was incorporated into the Huainanzi. As for the deaf, the form of their ears is intact, yet they are incapable of hearing. With the blind, the form of their eyes exists, yet they are incapable of seeing. Thus, speech is that by which one communicates themselves to others. Hearing is that by which others communicate themselves to you. The mute do not speak, the deaf do not hear. For those who are both mute and deaf, the way of humans cannot be communicated. Hence, those who have the condition or disorder being of muteness and deafness, even if their households exhaust all their resources in the attempt to find a cure, they shan't begrudge the expenditure. How then can we say that muteness and deafness are only in one's form or stature? The heart and mind, too, have them. So beyond elucidating what deafness physically is, this passage provides us with an introduction to the very essence of the social perception of deafness in early China. Accompanied with muteness, deafness is depicted as impeding a person's ability to communicate with their environment. Moreover, and I would argue more importantly, deafness is depicted as an essential inability to perceive one's surroundings. And this is quite unique to early China as opposed to Greece and Rome, but I will not expand on it today. It therefore becomes not only a condition of the ear, but a condition disabling the heart, Xin, as here as the feeling agent, and the intellectual mind, Zhi. In what follows, I will argue that early Chinese philosophical thinkers, perhaps similarly to Hugo, saw deafness of the mind as rendering a person ignorant. Contrary to Hugo, however, they tended to view deafness of the ear and deafness of the mind as inherently intertwined and undivorceable concepts, a view that most likely derived in turn from their understanding of the sense of hearing. But before I turn to the social perceptions of deafness, let me begin with a brief overview of early Chinese references to deafness outside philosophical discourses. While it is unnecessary to repeat these references or to read them out loud, they were alluded to in previous talks, I chose to include them here because they demonstrate that deafness was indeed considered a disability of a sort and was to be taken into account, at least to an extent, by local governments in overseeing the population and caring for the vulnerable. Here, grouping it with other types of disability, the Guanzi maintains that a government should care for its deaf, while the Li Ji advocates that employing them in the occupations that are suitable, that one should employ them in occupations that are suitable to their own skills. And I just want to point out that in the reference from the Guanzi here, this responsibility ends when their lives end. So similarly to what Michael pointed out, there are no perhaps no mourning rights. So on the physiological level, early Chinese texts portray deafness as a disability that is described as a bing or a ji, which relates to the ear and mostly is incurable. In medical texts, however, deafness is most commonly discussed not as a permanent impairment, nor as a condition requiring medical attention in its own right. Instead, medical accounts allude to deafness that is a side effect or a symptom of different underlying medical disorders. Hearing loss is largely addressed in these texts as a symptom of underlying qi issues, most commonly related to problems in the minor yang vessel, shaoyang, which runs vertically across the body from the outer side of the ankle and emerges among other points by the ear. Such hearing loss often appears to be temporary. One of the most revealing surviving examples depicting temporary and reversible hearing loss is the following from the Huangdi Neijing, which reads, when evil is settled in the networks vessels of the hand-yang brilliance conduits, it lets the affected person become deaf in that temporarily he does not hear a sound. And here I differ from Paul Anschul's translation, which renders 识不闻 as, apologies, 识不闻 as occasionally, I think it's temporarily, a temporary deafness. The text then goes on to depict the piercing that should be done to help the patient regain their sense of hearing. On the final case in which the sense of hearing is not regained, Zhang Zhicong comments, that's 17th century, this is a sign of deafness resulting from an inner harm. Piercing is possible only when deafness results and from an evil having settled in the network vessels. This final line is arguably of particular importance, as it draws the line between deafness as a medically treatable side effect and deafness as a permanent impairment. Those who never hear anything, 不识闻者, may refer to those who do not regain their lost hearing, or may even refer to the congenitally deaf. Etymological texts compiled throughout the Han contain an impressively wide variety of terms depicting and relating to deafness, which reveal a differentiation between various types of deafness and different terminologies across various localities. Given the social degradation of deafness, of which we shall soon come to learn, the richness of this passage from the Fangyan may be surprising. So I will read it out loud. Song and Zai mean deaf, long. Half deaf, here Ban Long, mean within the regions of Liang and Yi, it is called Zai. In the Qin and Jin, those who listen but are not wizened or whose hearing is unaccomplished are called Zai. Those who are born deaf, Shengerlong, in Chen and Chu and along the Huai River, they are called Song. In Jing and Yang and both east and west to the mountains, the deaf are called Song. Profound or severe Longzhishen deafness, amongst the regions of Qin and Jin, they are called Wa. In the external suburbs of Wu and Shu, those who in general do not have ears are also called Wa. Those who are called Kui are the same as those whose ears have been cut off, who within the Qin and Jin central lands are called Wa, and this is a different character for Wa. The 说文解字, the 说文解字 also contains a wide variety of deafness and hearing related terms and provides a good source for demonstrating just how diverse the understanding of various types of deafness may, and I repeat, may have been. And the reason why I say may is that all of the above notwithstanding, long remains the key term in describing and referring to deafness and the deaf, while most of the other terms we've seen here, often themselves defined by means of long, are nowhere else to be found in surviving texts, or very, very little to be found in them. So While deafness is closely linked with the ear, it is acknowledged, as we've seen in the passage from the Huainanzi, that having ears, or more precisely having the shape of the physical shape of an ear, does not necessarily entail having a sense of hearing. So with the exception of those whose ears have been mutilated, the deaf carried an invisible impairment. And this Professor Sterks wondered what an invisible impairment will be treated like. So as such, it is conceptually different to visibly detectable impairments, which were judged within the context of the importance attached in early Chinese thought to maintaining the body intact, or chuan. One might ask, how then is deafness as an impairment that does not impact the appearance of the body perceived by thinkers of the time? And what were the social approaches towards deafness in early China? A heavy clue can be found in the Shiming, an Eastern Han etymological text which determines that, quote, deafness, long, is a cage, also pronounced long. It is like living in a cage of ignorance with a listening that is unperceptive, end quote. What I find most striking about this reference is just how focused it is on the social construction of deafness. It places emphasis on the view that deafness is not only a sensory impairment, but practically a perceptual limitation. It is on the basis of views like this one that deafness is so often used in these texts as a metaphor for ignorance. On one hand, anyone who cannot hear, so the physically deaf, are immediately tagged as, and perhaps in reality have been, doomed to a life of seclusion or of secluded ignorance. On the other hand, anyone locked in a cage of ignorance, even if physically hearing, can be then conceptually described as deaf. And political critiques often use the concept of deafness as a tool for reprimanding ill-advised rulers. One such critique appears in the Zhangguo Zi. So we have Marquis Wen of Wei, who is dining with Tian Zifang and comments on the music that is played, saying that the sounds of the bells do not accord with one another. The left one is louder or higher, depends on how we translate Gao. Tian Zifang laughed. "Why are you laughing?" inquired Marquis Wen. Zifang said, "Thus I've heard, if the ruler is enlightened, he delights in government. If he is not enlightened, he delights in patterned sounds. Now my lord has been meticulous with regard to sound, and I fear you might be deaf with regards to issues of government." And the Marquis accepts these words. So I would like to suggest quite simply that this conceptualization of deafness essentially derives from early Chinese understandings of the sense of hearing. Hearing in early China, as was briefly suggested yesterday, was taken to be a crucial rule for gaining knowledge and corresponding with the world. In this sense, hearing was not only the act of absorbing sound, but also the internalization of sonic information, and by extension, the understanding of the world around us. In the eyes of early Chinese thinkers, hearing and knowing were virtually synonymous terms. As evidence, we have the graph wen, which means to hear something or to hear of something, but also meant to become aware of what is heard. And then the graph ting, to listen, but also to obey, and also to judge, to adjudicate by what is heard. The early Chinese philosophical understanding of the sense of hearing then can be said to comprise of two components. That is the physical hearing with the ear, and I would suggest to calling it ear-led or external hearing, and the internalization of what is heard. Let us name it mind-led or internal hearing. Therefore, those who have no means of hearing are perceived automatically as having no means of knowing. But on the other hand, those who overtly rely on physical hearing and do not hear with their mind have a comprehension that is akin to that of a physically deaf person who is incapable of hearing their surroundings. So a constant tension exists between the external physical hearing and the internal hearing. Mention was made yesterday of the way in which the overuse of some sensory organs is said to impede a person's internal process of perception. One example amongst many can be seen here on the screen, a passage attributed to Shen Buhai, which goes as far as to suggest that one discards the usage of their physical senses in order to attain better perception. And this passage is somewhat reminiscent of the famous passage from the Lao Tzu, also mentioned yesterday by Dr. Chapman, that states that the 5 colors blind men's eyes, the 5 tones deafen men's ears, and the 5 flavors dull men's mouth. This portrayal of the senses demonstrates a clear preference for cognitive or inner utilization of the senses. Excessive usage of the physical ear, and here it's the 5 tones, obstructs or deafens the mind-led inner ear. In other words, excessive sonic stimulation may cause a reduced ability to process sonic cues and convert them into knowledge. The Lao Tzu statement concludes with the notion that for this reason, the sages operate with their guts and not with their eyes. Indeed, some extensions of this idea that are seen here on the screen, and which seem to have been originated in a proverb of the times, imply that intentional blocking of one's hearing, and thus the creation of artificial deafness, was desired for those seeking an elevated status, and that the sages or rulers that aspire to sagehood may have temporarily deafened themselves by using earplugs to achieve better internal hearing. However, 2 things are worth keeping in mind here. Firstly, the production of sagely deafened hearing still assumed a sense of hearing to begin with. A perceptive sense of hearing, which enables one to process the sounds of this world, is no less important a trait for the sage than the ability to block his hearing. And an understanding of sound is necessary for the apprehension and appreciation of the absence of sound. Or as Roy Sorensen puts it here, hearing silence is the successful perception of the absence of sound. Secondly, deafness is still portrayed in most of these texts negatively as an undesired effect. So while blocking one's hearing is being theorized as an ideal way to listen, the condition of the ears being deafened, still the long, largely remains an undesired one. So to long one's ears is a negative effect on the ear. So before concluding this talk, I would like to mention a final group of references that demonstrate the balance between physical and cognitive hearing in a different way. References that use perceptual impairments to describe members of society who do not seek to study, who are unstudious, often described as Bouphe. This is a common analogy which appears in different forms across various texts. In such references, deafness is grouped with additional perceptual impairments, most commonly with the rhyming blindness, mang, and as an impairment of the eye, and madness, quang, as an impairment of or a dysfunction of the heart-mind. And note that the sensory impairments or the impairments that are grouped here in the philosophical texts are different to the impairments that were grouped in the political texts that relate to policy that one should take with the deaf in their territories. So the Shinshu reads, heaven gave birth to man and gave him ears by which to hear. He who does not learn his hearing is no better than that of a deaf man. Heaven gave gave men eyes by which to see. He who does not learn his sight is no better than that of a blind man. And it continues with speech and the mute, and with the heart, mind, and cognizance, and the madman. And just to show another example, one of many examples for this specific analogy, in a matter befitting his somewhat cynical character, Wang Chong in his Longheng provides a similar analogy, which includes a harsh portrayal of people whose senses are dysfunctional as incomplete, Fei Changren. And note that the unstomach, those lacking a sense of smell, replace the quang, the med. Wang Chong, by the way, also compares the blind and deaf to the grass and trees, says that they are as useless as the grass and trees. So while the comparison with the unlearned is clearly metaphorical, it still presents the physical on one hand and the intellectual on the other. It was the balance between the two, hearing ordinarily with one's ears and using one's mind-led hearing, that underlay the early Chinese conception of hearing as a whole. In light of this perception of hearing, it seems that deafness was above all socially treated not as a physical disability, but as an intellectual one. So far as philosophical texts are concerned, they portray a strange interplay between idealizing artificially manufactured deafness on one hand and being averted, the aversion from the idea of the deafened ear on the other. The fact remains that these accounts enlighten us very little with regards to how the deaf themselves live their lives, their everyday lives. Of this, there is no trace, and not even a single narrative that features a congenitally deaf protagonist. And if I mentioned earlier that deafness was an invisible impairment, the deaf themselves were so invisible socially that in a way they were excluded from philosophical discussions of deafness. But one thing can be read between the lines of these accounts. While some hearing people who indulge in sound were anecdotally compared with the deaf themselves were considered as having a pair of ears that cannot perceive and a mind that cannot hear. Thank you very much. I'll stop here.